Welcome to the More to the Story podcast. I am so glad that you have come along. This has been going to be a great show, not because of anything that I do, but because of my guest. I'm so thankful to be able to bring him to my audience, and I know that you will benefit from hearing the message that he has today. But first, I want you to know this podcast comes to you from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. And we do that through a host of programs from bachelor's and master's to doctoral degrees. We have a lay initiative called the Wesley Institute, and we were one of the first seminaries approved by the Global Methodist Church. And it's been an interesting ride for us over the last year. We have added 300 Global Methodist Church pastors in the last year. You know, we never even had more than 190 students at one time. So we've added more students in the last year than we've ever had at any point in our history. And we're at the largest point in our history. Thankful for this opportunity to serve the church. So if you're interested in going deeper in your study of God's word, and you want to do that at a school that values the inerrancy of Scripture and the promise and power of the sanctified life, we'd love for you to check us out at wbs.edu. Also, I'm thankful to my friend Bill Roberts, who's a financial planner. He comes alongside people, helping them think about their retirement. He does a great job with that. I would really encourage you to take a look at his information at williamhroberts.com. And finally, I'd love for people to sign up for my email list at andymillerthird.com. That's andymillerIII.com. And if you sign up for that email list, I'll send you a free tool called 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching. And if you see on my website there, we have several courses that are available, books, past podcasts. We'd love for you to check all that out. All right. I am so glad to welcome into the podcast somebody I've wanted to talk to for a long time. His name's Scott Klusendorf. He's the president of the Life Training Institute, and he is the author of a second edition of his book, his well-known book, The Case for Life. This one is expanded significantly. It came out in November, author of several other books and articles, a well-known speaker. Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Andy, terrific to be with you.
Man, I remember I heard you the first time out. No, it probably was more than 10 years ago on Focus on the Family or something like that.
You invited me anyway?
Oh, there we go. Yes. I did. Even though I've heard you before. That's why I invited you.
Oh, fantastic. Well, it's a joy to be with you. Sorry to cut in with my sarcasm. It's my love language.
There it goes. Well, we will pray for your wife. That's how it goes. Well, and interestingly, you have an interesting story because you came to the pro-life movement and making this a really your vocation and ministry, serving in the pro-life movement. Maybe not from the usual perspective. Tell us a little about your story and how you came to be so passionate about this area.
Well, Andy, I've always been pro-life. That was never in question. There was never a time where I thought, it's rationally plausible or morally plausible to be in favor of abortion. That never was my way of looking at the world. However, I really wasn't doing much on the issue. I attitudinally felt bad about it, but wasn't acting behaviorally like I felt bad about it. So my rhetoric did not match my behavior on it. Well, that all changed in November of 1990 while I was serving as an associate pastor of a church in Southern California. The local pregnancy center director invited me to a breakfast she had prepared for pastors. And there was supposed to be at least 100 of us showing up for this thing. And I showed up, and it was myself, 4 other guys, and their wives. So a pretty dismal turnout when the topic was abortion, sadly. Well, thankfully, the speaker that morning, Greg Cunningham, did not let that deter him from delivering an absolutely riveting pro-life presentation. And I like the guy because I thought as I listened to him, he's intelligent, he's logical, he is persuasive. He was a lawyer, so he presented his case in a very structured way. I had heard pro-life speakers, quite frankly, Andy, that had been more emotionally driven, more scattered in the way they presented their case, and I had kind of grown weary of it. But this guy was spot on. But that's not what changed my life. What changed my life is what he did about halfway through his talk. He showed an 8-minute video depicting abortion.
Wow.
I had never seen abortion, Andy. And as I looked at those pictures, I thought to myself, I am no different than the priest and the Levite who passed by on the other side of the road. I say I care about this issue, but I don't act like I care about this issue. And that day I went home and I took that VHS tape he showed. By the way, VHS tapes were these rectangular things.
What is that?
Yeah. You know, But I showed that to my wife Stephanie, and she's like, "Hey, whatever you feel stirring in you, I'm on board." And long story short, 6 months later, with the blessing of the church I worked at, I left that associate pastor's position to go pursue how might I help Christians better articulate their views on this issue. This was pre-internet. We didn't have the ability to research things through Google. Google did not exist, to my knowledge, in 1990. But I was able to go bury myself in the UCLA Research Library, pull up microfiche of documents. Remember microfiche?
I do.
Maybe
I
you
do.
don't. But that's how they used to store things. And slowly but surely, I built a body of knowledge that has helped me equip Christians to make a case for life.
Wow. Now it's interesting. Here you are, like in a full-time job as an associate pastor, and you make this pivot. Well, how did you functionally do that? I mean, did you within that 6 months start an organization, raise money that made this possible? I mean, here you are, like at this key stage in your
Yeah.
life.
Well,
How did that work?
that's a great question. I think it helped that I had a little bit of the entrepreneurial drive in me to
Yeah.
where I was so convinced I needed to do this work. I was going to do it no matter what. It was going to happen. So that meant that I was willing to endure a lot of hardship. I mean, my wife and I were broke for a number of years, to be quite frank,
Okay.
until I could figure out how to fund this. So I went to work for Center for Bioethical Reform, which was the speaker's organization that I had heard at that event. I just hounded him and followed him around until he basically put me on staff. And by the way, this is good advice to some of your young ministry candidates.
Yeah, sure.
When you decide you want a mentor, politely just don't go away. Don't don't stalk them, in ways you shouldn't. I'm not saying show up at their house door, but I would go everywhere this guy would speak within 100 miles of my house, and I would be there listening, mastering the material, learning from him in nonverbal ways and in conversation, and that helped me immensely. But
Hmm.
I think the other thing that helped is I was able to join his organization and raise support through that organization. There are no pro life groups out there, Andy, that have money to take on additional staff. If you want to
Hmm.
work in this field, you're going to have to raise your own funding. And that's uncomfortable for a lot of people. But here's the question that drove me to do it anyway.
Okay.
Are any of the reasons I might give for not asking for support worth the price of children's lives that might have been saved had I been more courageous? And
Wow.
that framing just drove me to do whatever was needed to get funded to do this work. And eventually it happened. And this was all before I had any kind of platform at all. I
Right.
had zero paid speaking events back then. Nobody knew me from Bob.
Wow.
So it was basically raise support or perish. And
Mm.
that's what I did starting out. And then later, when I did have a speaking platform and I no longer needed that monthly support, I was able to use that money and transfer it out of my account into starting an organization, Life Training Institute, that could be used to equip pro-lifers.
Wow. So Life Changing Institute, then tell us about that. And we'll get into, I want to get into some of the specifics of the type of things you talk about on a regular basis. But as you have then developed a platform online and you speak all over the place, what is it that Life Training Institute does?
Well, here's the question I asked myself when we started Life Training Institute. What can we do better than anybody else in the field? And that's not a prideful question. I'm not talking about better in terms of pleasing to the Lord or better spiritually, because we're all flawed sinners. But what I meant was, what is the skill set we bring to this that we think we deliver better than anybody else? And that was
Mhm.
easy to answer. And it was this: we know how to convey the pro life position clearly. We know how to do it in a way that's winsome. We know how to do it in a way that's persuasive. And we're good at equipping others to do what we do. So
Yes.
we're not a testimony organization. We don't go around and tell our stories. I very rarely talk about me when I go speak. For example, this week on Thursday morning, I'll be in front of a couple of hundred high school students in Pennsylvania doing an assembly. I'm not going to talk about me. They don't care about me. I'm going to
Yeah.
talk about one thing. Why is the pro life position true and reasonable to believe? and I'm going to give them reasons. So what we do is apologetics talks. So we're not a testimony organization. We're not a post-abortion recovery organization. We don't do abstinence talks. Now, I support those works. Those are all fine ministries. But what we discovered when we started LTI, I looked around and I thought nobody is doing talks on why the pro-life position is reasonable and why the arguments for it stand up in the public square, and why we can give public reasons for what we believe that critics cannot just dismiss as some private religious view. So I thought that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to do one thing that we do better than anybody else. The old adage, less is more, certainly applied here. Rather than trying to be all things pro-life, we picked one thing we thought we could do better than anybody else, and we continue to focus on that one thing.
Beautiful. I love that principle in general. Like even at a seminary, it's tempting for us to say, you know what we could do? We could start a church. We could end up moving ourselves in a position where we have a counseling program. And not saying that's not something that would be beneficial. I'm sure they're, creating a lab church situation could, but we want to focus in on the work that our scholars do, preparing, serving the church, but at the same time serving the church. Now with LTI, have you started to bring a cohort of speakers around who are also take the same perspective that you do? Is that something that you guys do?
Well, I've had a team as high as 7 speakers at one time. We're down to 3 right now, and that's because of less being more. It actually helps us streamline what we're doing. But those that have moved on, we've been able to place in other ministries and help them start their own organizations that help those speakers thrive. My view of ministry, Andy, is a little different than some. The people that I get in the game, I don't really view as my people. They're God's people. My job is to get them in the game. And my college pastor had a great phrase. He said, always give away your best talent. And we've done that. We have given away some of our best speakers. And that's how you build the kingdom. This really isn't about building Scott's ministry. It's about building the Lord's work. And we have an open hand with that. I tell my staff when I bring them on, there will come a day, not if, but when that day comes where you are convinced you can flourish better outside the confines of LTI, then we're going to help you do that. We're not going to clutch onto you. We're not going to try to guilt you into staying. We're going to release you to be what God has called you to be. So that's the way I approach this. So our team fluctuates in size, and sometimes we're smaller just because we've come through a season of giving away. In fact, just 4 months ago, I arguably gave away the best speaker I've ever had. She is just top shelf, a gal named Megan Allman. I mean, you can't get any better than she is. And she's joined a friend of mine's ministry called Apologetics Inc., run by my dear friend Mike Sherrard, and she's flourishing there. And it's great. Yeah. She's helping them, and the kingdom is enlarging, and I'm excited. We're down a speaker, but you know what? It didn't take long before the Lord sent someone else that we have now put on the team, and she's going to be joining us in a greater role very shortly here. So the Lord takes care of us. I don't worry about that stuff.
Amen. So you have this very narrow focus, which is incredibly helpful. Does that mean you all don't do anything of legislation either? I'm sure you're aware of things that are happening, but you don't try to influence that. And there's other aspects of the pro-life movement.
Well, we don't get involved specifically with a particular piece of legislation. Usually we may speak to it, but we're not trying to help shepherd it through a congressional hall or a state house. What we do is we do talk about how Christians have a duty to be engaged politically, that your Christian worldview should apply to all of life, not just some of it. And to say, for example, as some Christians do, that we ought not get involved in politics, we should just be about kingdom business, is really quite question-begging, because it assumes that kingdom business means everything but this little area over here, when that's precisely the question under dispute. Does the Christian worldview apply to all of life or only some of it? And we believe it applies to all. And that means then that's going to inform how Christians approach politics. Some people will say, well, that makes you sectarian. I really don't care, Andy. I'm interested in what does the Bible teach about how we apply our biblical worldview.
Amen. And you have centered a lot of your talks, and I imagine the same thing is true with your team, on a basic logical syllogism. And I'd love for you to outline that. And even as we work through that, that will then lead to answering several other questions that people have about the pro-life case.
Sure. Well, we tell people all the time the three most important words in pro-life apologetics are, number one, syllogism.
Amen.
Number two, syllogism. I'll let you guess what the third one's going to be.
Let me guess.
You don't need to have prophetic insight to know this, okay? But syllogism, syllogism, syllogism. Why is that? Because when it comes to the topic of abortion, people love to change the topic. Now, I know you've never done this, but maybe some of your listeners have been in a dispute with their wife or significant other, and they were losing. Every rational mind in the universe knew they were losing, and so they changed the subject on their spouse or significant other. I know you and I are more mature than that, but those people out there might do that. And it certainly happens with abortion. People don't want to talk about the main issue. They want to talk about everything but the main issue. They want to talk about choice, privacy, trusting women, forcing your morality, whatever they pull out of a hat. None of which have anything to do with whether or not it's morally permissible to intentionally kill an innocent human being. So by having a clearly stated syllogism, we force people to stay on topic. And it gives us an anchoring point where we can come back and say, now remember what I argued a moment ago. How does your objection refute that argument? So what is the pro-life syllogism? Here it is. Premise one. It's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. Now, note something right out of the gate. We are not arguing that killing is always wrong. We're saying it's always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being.
Right.
Premise two, abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Conclusion, therefore, abortion is wrong. It's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. Abortion does that, therefore it's wrong. Now, Andy, that syllogism might be mistaken, and I'll tell you how it can be refuted. Here I am coaching people on how to refute my own argument.
There you go.
But my argument can be refuted, but you need to do it the right way. And the right way to do it is to show either that the premises do not lead to the conclusion logically, meaning the argument is invalid, or you show that one or more of the premises is false, meaning the argument is unsound. Or I suppose you could show the terms are unclear. Outside of that, the argument stands. It doesn't do any good to say, well, that's just your religious view. Arguments are sound or unsound, valid or invalid. Calling an argument religious is a cop-out. It's actually a category error, as my colleague Frank Beckwith points out. It's kind of like asking, how tall is the number 3? That just doesn't work. You got to do the hard work of refuting the argument. It also doesn't work to attack the person. I mean, almost always, whenever I do my podcast, the comments that come back from critics have zero to do with the actual argument. Here's what they are. Well, you're a man. You have no right to talk about this. You don't have a uterus. Of course, the snarky part of me, Andy, wants to look at them and say, how do you know that I'm a man?
And there you go.
I mean, really.
Yeah.
In today's binary culture or non-binary culture, do you really want to be judging my pronouns? I mean, I want to say that I don't. But the principle here is arguments don't have gender. People do. Arguments stand or fall on their merits, not the person making them. I'll give you a related example, and I'm sure you know this. One of the most powerful arguments for theism originated from an Islamic scholar, not a Christian scholar. And it's what we call the Kalam cosmological argument. It basically says anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe was caused. Now, that's the source for that argument is not Christian. It is theistic, but it's not Christian. Should Christians reject that argument simply because its source is non-Christian? And the answer is no. That would be a case of the genetic fallacy, faulting an argument based on its origins rather than its merits. The argument is either a good one or it's not. Its origins are irrelevant to its quality. And our culture today does not know how to separate the argument from the person making it. Suppose you're the worst person in the world, Andy. You're worse than Stalin.
Yeah.
And yet
Wow.
you argue that slavery is wrong. Could your argument still be good even if you own slaves and even if you do awful things to human beings? The
Right.
answer
Right.
is yes, because your argument stands on its merits, not your behavior.
Yes. So your arguments don't have feelings, and this
No.
like it's just and so back to your first premise. So you have intentionally killing. So why do you use that word intentional?
Well, because not all killing is wrong. For example,
Mhm.
take self-defense. You're out with your family one night, and a thug comes along and he wants to harm your wife and kids. Your intention in stopping him is to save your family, not to intentionally kill an innocent human being. He's not
Mhm,
innocent
mhm.
in this case. Or war, for example. A general in a just war can foresee the deaths of civilians, but he does not intend them the way Hitler did when he bombed London during the Blitz in 1940. In other words, killing for the sake of preventing a greater harm might be justifiable. For example, in stopping a dictator or stopping a thug from harming your family. In that case, it's not that you intend the death of an innocent human being. Your real intention is to protect your family or protect your citizens. So,
Mhm.
therefore, killing in those cases does not involve the same moral problem that it does when you intentionally kill an innocent human being.
That's helpful. And we talk. You say specifically intentionally killing an innocent
Yes.
human being. Now, when you say innocent, likely this is helping us. Like some people would be opposed to death penalty in any case. Like it doesn't matter at all. But you're trying to delineate probably even other opportunities where there is intentional killing. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. Now, look, the death penalty may be wrong, but it's not wrong for the same reason abortion is wrong.
Okay.
Abortion is wrong because it involves the intentional killing of an innocent human being. With a death penalty case, capital offenses involve, by definition, someone who is not innocent. So there's
Right.
no parallel between the two. Now, again, maybe there's a biblical case to be made against capital punishment. I'm open to hearing that, but it's not parallel. There's no symmetry there between the argument we're making against abortion and the argument one might make against capital punishment.
Yeah, that's great. So when you get into this discussion, is that something that's brought up? Is that a way that people can try to change the subject in the moment? Well, what do
Oh,
you think about yeah?
absolutely. It's a subtle ad hominem where they attack the person rather than the argument. And here's why it's an ad hominem. They're trying to make the case that you, the pro lifer, are inconsistent. Okay,
Mm.
maybe I am. Suppose I'm the most inconsistent person in the world. Could my syllogism still be valid and
Wow.
sound, even if I inconsistently apply the conclusion? And the
Yes.
answer is yes, because the argument stands on its merits, on its principles, not me and how I behave. And this is something we have to stress over and over and over again. In fact, sometimes when I'm in front of secular audiences at universities or elsewhere, otherwise open forums, I end up coming back to this about every 5 minutes because the objection that's brought up inevitably ends up being a subtle ad hominem or a case of the genetic fallacy, faulting an idea based on its origins rather than its merits, or it's a mere assertion that isn't an argument to begin with. So these are the kinds of things that we just see over and over again.
I gotta say, when did you ask the question? When did you take logic? And oh, have you thanked your logic teacher, whoever it was? Because I'm telling you, man, you have got you really employ it so well. When did
You
you
know,
take
it's funny.
logic?
I learned logic at a public junior college near my house in Los Angeles from a Jewish instructor named Rosenthal. And the way he would teach logic, it was hilarious. He would bring his sound system to class and
Yeah.
he would crank up to ear busting decibels Van Halen, Boston, AC/DC, Dire Straits. And he said, he'd put the lyrics of the songs in front of us and we would analyze them for arguments. That's how I learned.
Oh, interesting. It's so, I mean, honestly, that guy, even though he's Jewish, like he has a special place in the kingdom if he comes to Christ, because you have really deployed this so well. And I look, my logic teacher, Joseph Okello, Dr. Joseph Okello, he's a Kenyan, teaches at Asbury Seminary. Man, He would be so proud of me if I could just be like you, Scott, because you've got it, my man. I love it. Okay, the other side of this, the human life. You say intentionally killing human life. One of the probably the chief arguments against this is, well, it's not the same thing. It's not the life is. I'm not. Don't believe, I don't believe these things, but that's one of the chief things that people do is they'll contest that idea that we're talking about the same type of life.
Well, let's ask a very basic question before we unpack that even more. The critic needs to answer this. How is it possible for two human parents to create offspring that isn't human, but later becomes so? How is that even possible? They need to argue for that, not merely assert it. And this is a classic example of people making assertions rather than arguments. And the burden of proof is on the critic at this point, not the pro-life advocate. If I claim there's a pink elephant swinging above your head right now, Andy, by the way, if you were to look, you didn't, but if you did, you would have done the right thing. The burden of proof is not on you, it's on me because I'm the one making the claim. And too often, Christians assume the burden of proof when it's not on them to do. The critic is making the claim that there can be such a thing as some kind of entity that's not human that comes from human parents. Okay, I'm open to hearing your argument for that, but merely asserting it isn't going to do. But let's go further. Living things of any species do not start off as one thing and then become some species entirely different in the course of their development. And I ask critics, can you name for me some living thing that starts as one kind of species and becomes another? And of course, inevitably, they say, well, caterpillars become butterflies. Okay, but it's the same species. It's just that the caterpillar changes its external form. It does not become some other kind of natural entity in the process of that. Oh, then they say things like, well, an acorn is not an oak tree. Okay, you're right. An acorn is not an oak tree, but it is an oak. And the oak tree that becomes the mature form with the strong roots and the strong trunk and is the source of what fortitude is the same enduring entity that was once the acorn. And people say, well, that embryo is not a baby. You're right, it's not a baby, but it is a human being at the earliest stages of its development. And the embryo that you once were is identical to the adult human being you are today. There's been no substantial change to your essential nature that you started off as one thing and then became another.
So when you move through this idea, like if there is, I've heard you use an acronym that helps us kind of place this, like where we can come with a move against these type of arguments. What is that?
Well, we use an acronym called SLED, S-L-E-D, and that is an argument we use to answer the question of human value. The science of embryology answers the question, what is the unborn? What is the unborn? A distinct, living, and whole human being. You didn't come from an embryo, you once were an embryo. So the science of embryology is essentially answering the identity question. What are we from the beginning? We're distinct, living, and whole human beings. But then there's a human value question to be answered. What is it that makes humans valuable in the first place? And here we have a cultural collide happening right now, a collision between two rival worldviews of the human person. We have the endowment view, which is grounded in the concept of the Imago Dei, the Declaration of Independence, the writings of Abraham Lincoln, for example, that argue that human beings are equal and valuable by nature, not function. What gives you value as a human being is your essential nature, not the performance levels you can immediately achieve, such as having self-awareness, consciousness, whatever. The rival to that worldview is what we call the performance view. The performance view, unlike the endowment view, says being human is nothing special at all. What matters is having cognitive function, the ability to see yourself existing over time, the ability to interact with your environment, the ability to value your existence. And until you can immediately exercise those arbitrarily selected traits, you may be biologically human, but there's no you there, and you're certainly not valuable in having a right to life. You can be killed. Now, of course, that just assumes all kinds of things. It assumes a philosophical anthropology of the human person known as body-self dualism, which is the belief that the real you has nothing to do with your body. The real you is your thoughts, your cognitive self, your aims, your desires. And by the way, it's not just abortion where we see this body-self dualism popping out. It's the whole debate over same-sex marriage, transgenderism. I mean, think about this claim. I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. I mean, that was absurd 30 years ago, but it's not absurd anymore to a lot of people. Why? Because they've bought into the idea that the real person has nothing to do with their body. Their body tells them nothing about what their intrinsic purposes should be as human beings. Rather, your body is just mere physical matter. You're free to manipulate any way you want because the real you is not your body. It's your cognitive self, your aims, your desires, and what you might feel you are. That's the real you. And therefore, it's entirely plausible to say that embryo does not exist until it has a cognitive self. It ignores the body completely. Well, that's not the biblical worldview. The biblical worldview is that human beings in their essential anthropology are a dynamic union of body and soul. That's the basic substance view that we hold to. You are identical to the embryo you once were because there was never a time you were some other entity. You were always you. You were always a dynamic union of body and soul and never were anything less.
And so does that, we say that starts at conception?
Yes.
That we just like go to that line. And so when we get to SLED, then this kind of gives us some parameters for thinking countering these arguments. Tell us what SLED stands for.
Well, what SLED does is it helps force the correct question. Our critics love to say that embryo is different from us. And the answer is yes, he is. But here's the real question. Is he different from us in ways that justify intentionally killing him? That's the question we need to answer. Which, by the way, this isn't a new question. This is exactly the question that Lincoln would press on his opponents who would argue for slavery. Lincoln's opponents would say that slave differs from us. And Lincoln would say, so, but does he differ from us in ways that justify enslaving him? And Lincoln ruthlessly destroyed their attempts to make these differences meaningful. And the SLED acronym helps us do the same thing with those who argue that the unborn don't count because they're different from us. Yes, they are. But do those differences matter? And there's principally four. Size, the embryo is smaller than us. Level of development, he's less developed. He's in a different environment, and his degree of dependency is more. So think of the acronym SLED, S-L-E-D, to remember these four differences. Now, let's ask the real question here. Do any of those four differences matter such that we can say it's permissible to kill you as an embryo, but not now as an adult? Size, you were certainly smaller as the embryo. But here's the question. Since when does body size determine value? That's what our critics need to answer. They want to assert that or assume that it does, but they need to argue for it. How does body size give you more of a right to life? I mean, men are generally larger than women. Do they deserve more rights than women simply because they're larger? If any of your listeners say yes, I hope they remain single. But think about this. Shaquille O'Neal, the former basketball star with the Los Angeles Lakers, he was 7'2". He's a foot taller than you and I. Does that mean he's more valuable and human because of it? Clearly, body size doesn't equal value. What about your level of development? Yes, you were less developed as an embryo. There's your L in that SLED acronym. And my answer to that is, so why does development matter in the first place? How developed do I have to be not to be killed? And why that level of development and not something else? And what people love to do is assert categories of value they don't argue for. It's not enough to say, well, that embryo doesn't have cognitive thought waves yet. Why are those value giving in the first place? They need to argue for that, not merely assert it. So, okay, yes, you were less developed as an embryo. 2-year-old girls are less developed than 21-year-old young men. 2-year-old girls do not have a developed reproductive system yet. Are they less human and valuable than the 21-year-old who does? I speak to teenagers all the time. I'll be speaking to a group, as I mentioned, this Thursday in outside Newark. And I'm going to say to them, you are less developed than your parents. You're
Right.
less developed than your parents physically, and you're less developed than your parents intellectually, which will come as a complete shock to all of them. But you don't reach your intellectual peak until your mid 40s. Does that mean mom and dad have a greater right to life than you simply because they're more developed? In other words, the critic needs to argue for why development matters in the first place. It's not enough to just assert a difference. And then E stands for environment. Size, level of development, environment, meaning where we're located. And the key question is this, Andy: how does where you are determine what you are? In other words, you did not change who you are when you moved from the parking lot into the studio at your seminary there. You changed, I'm going to guess you walked 70 yards at least, or thereabouts,
Sure,
at
sure.
least
That sounds
70
right.
feet.
Yeah. Yeah.
If a journey of 70 feet did not change you from one kind of thing to another, how does a journey of 7 inches down the birth canal suddenly
Wow.
transform you from non-human, non-valuable thing we can intentionally butcher to a valuable human being we cannot? You got to answer that question. And again, our critics don't answer how a mere change of location changes your essential nature. They've got to
Mm-hmm.
make that argument, and they
Mm,
never, ever do.
mm.
Then finally, degree of dependency. How does dependency on another human being mean we can intentionally kill you? Now, I mentioned to you that I live outside Atlanta in a little town called Noonan, Georgia. We're famous for The Walking Dead because that's where
Okay.
they filmed that show. It's a zombie show. I don't know if you've seen it or not. Some of your listeners probably have. But here's the premise of the story. The hero of the show is a guy named Rick Grimes. He's a sheriff, a local sheriff. And while he and his buddy are out on a routine criminal arrest, Rick gets shot by a bad guy and he's in a coma. And his partner Rick takes him to the hospital, and Rick is there. And while he's in a coma for over 30 days, the zombie apocalypse breaks out. And the zombies come through the hospital and they do in everybody there, but they don't find Rick. Somehow they miss Rick. His buddy Shane had managed to hide him well, and so Rick didn't get hurt by the zombie attack. Well, Rick wakes up a month later and he's trying to figure out what happened to the world I once knew. Remember, no one stayed behind to help Rick. He's on his own in that hospital. And he wakes up, and season 1 of The Walking Dead is Rick trying to figure out what happened to the world he once knew. Where's his wife, Lori? Where's his son, Carl? Where's his buddy, Shane? Let's change that script, though. Let's say one doctor had stayed behind in that hospital to care for Rick. And while Rick's in a coma, Rick depends totally on that doctor for survival. Does that doctor have a moral green light to slit Rick's throat simply because Rick depends totally on him for survival?
Right.
Size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency are not good reasons for saying we could kill you then, but not now.
Mm. It's so helpful to be able to have that in mind as we're working through these premises. And when you get to the second premise, do you get challenged on that much? Because you can spend most of your time working through that first premise. Because I think like most people just that's where their problem areas come. But would anybody try to say abortion isn't innocently willfully, intentionally killing innocent human life?
Yeah, you can get thinkers like Eileen McDonough and to some degree Judith Jarvis Thompson who argue that the fetus is an aggressor that inappropriately imposes itself on the woman's body. In fact, McDonough goes so far as to say that a fetus is basically raping the mother by forcing itself on the mother's body.
Wow.
But wait a minute, if the fetus is a rapist, it's a rapist the mother helped create by
Mm.
engaging in an act that is ordered toward procreation. So those arguments really, I think, start to fall apart when you look at them. And then, two, they're based on a very radical concept of bodily autonomy, an idea that bodily autonomy is absolute. But I think that can be challenged. Again, it's not enough to assume bodily autonomy. You got to argue for it.
Mm.
So, for example, if bodily autonomy is absolute, what would be wrong with a mother conceiving a child for the express purpose of aborting the child at 6 months to use its bodily organs to treat disease in other people? Well, nothing would be wrong with it. If bodily rights are absolute, which that argument purports that they are. Or imagine that a mother is suffering from morning sickness and she decides to take thalidomide against her doctor's advice to help mitigate the symptoms of nausea. Well, as you know, thalidomide causes children to be born with disformed limbs, and in some cases, no limbs at all. Let's say that mother gives birth to a child at 9 months that instead of arms, we've only got a pair of flippers. Do we think that mother acted wrongly in harming that child? Well, not if bodily autonomy arguments are persuasive, because it is only the mother that has any say at all over this. So I think we can point out where bodily autonomy arguments really run into some counterintuitive counterexamples here.
Yeah. And when you think about your debating through the years, and that's part of what you present to large groups and, high school groups, college groups, but you've also taken formal debates. Tell me about some of those experiences and how you interact in those environments.
Well, the person I've debated the most at this point is the former president of the ACLU, Nadine Strawson. She was president of the ACLU for, I think, 17 years. Nadine and I, believe it or not, are friends. She's wrong, Andy, but we are friends. It doesn't do any good to hate her, and we don't hate each other. We actually get along quite well. And I think that's good because, look, she's no more lost in her sins than I was in mine before God found me. So there's the theological reason to not be aggressive and be a bad neighbor to someone like Nadine. But there's also a vocational reason to have a friendship. She draws crowds of people to hear my case that would never come hear me, but they will come hear her. So she's doing me a favor as far as I'm concerned. And I am confident enough that my case is solid enough to where I'm not going to lose anybody who holds my view. And I only have to gain with people that hold her view. So there's reason to maintain a friendly relationship here. I think the debate I would direct your listeners to is the one we recently did, or the most recent debate we did at Wayne State University. And that debate is, I think, instructive for a lot of reasons. It's a spirited debate, but you'll notice there's no nasty personal attacks. In fact, at the end of it, you'll see the two of us embrace. We really do get along, and I appreciate a lot of things about Nadine. And the one thing I really like about her is that she is a proponent of free speech. She does not like the cancel culture, the woke culture that wants to shut down debate. I can appreciate that about her. And a little tutorial here to your listeners: learn to appreciate some things about those you look at as intellectual opponents. Don't just assume that there's nothing good that can come out of them because they hold a bad position on a particular issue. Look for things that you can applaud while you equally work hard to refute the things you find irrational.
Yes. So when you're working through things that you find irrational, what are some of the arguments with Nadine, for instance? You've debated her multiple times. Does anything new come? I mean, what has is there been anything that's caught you and you thought, I haven't thought about that before, or it's like challenging in that moment? And maybe talk through some of those arguments that you find challenging and how you work through them.
Nadine's primary argument is the state should not be involved in the privacy of the home. And my way of responding to that in a debate with her is to say to the audience, she likes to speak first, and I let her, it's fine. I say to the audience, men and women, I agree with everything Nadine just said. She is absolutely correct that there should be no government interference with abortion. She's absolutely correct that pro-lifers like me ought to butt out of this issue. She's absolutely correct. We should use our tax funding to fund abortions for women who can't afford it. And she's absolutely correct. There should be no state legislation regulating abortion at all. I agree with her completely. She's right if, and at that point, of course, all the pro-life students pass out in the audience. If what? If the unborn are not human. And if Nadine can make the case tonight that the unborn are not human, I will concede this debate. Because I say to that audience, I am vigorously pro-choice on women choosing their own husbands, choosing their own worldviews, choosing the careers they wish to pursue, the pets they wish to own, the cars they wish to drive, unless they're Priuses. I'm pro-choice on all those issues. But some choices are wrong, like intentionally killing an innocent human being simply because he's in the way of something we want. But if Nadine can demonstrate the unborn are not human, I'm with her. So that's how I frame this debate. In other words, I'm not going to let her talk about choice and who decides, forcing morality, or any of those other issues. We're going to talk about what is the unborn. That's the question in this debate. And she doesn't really make a case that proves the unborn aren't human. Her principal arguments are miscarriages happen in up to a third of all pregnancies. All right. How does it follow that because nature spontaneously triggers a miscarriage, that A, the embryos in question are not human, or B, we may intentionally kill them? I mean, earthquakes happen in third world countries and kill thousands of people. Does that justify mass murder? Of course not. So that argument is an entire non sequitur. It does not work at all. It simply does not follow that because nature does X, we may intentionally do X. That's not going to work. That's the is-ought fallacy on display right there. I think another argument she likes to make is the idea that people disagree on when life begins. Why, the Supreme Court recognized in the Casey decision that there's no consensus on when life begins. And she'll argue that the Roe court said the same thing. All right. How does it follow that because people disagree, nobody is right? People once disagreed on whether women should have a right to vote or whether black kids could go to school.
Right.
Does it follow there were no right answers on those issues?
Right.
The absence of consensus, as Hadley Arcus points out, does not entail an absence of truth. You got to do the hard work of investigating a matter. So those are some of her key points.
Yeah, that same argument, that absence is something that people will often say, the absence of a consensus. Well, people disagree about these scriptures, or people disagree, or there's Calvinists and Arminian, Calvinists and Wesleyans, and so since there's a difference, and then nothing can be true. Let's just not talk about. But that just assumes that there isn't a truth, that there isn't something that is right, and ultimately, we're going to try to bring our arguments together to get to what is the truth, and we might end up there might be things that we do disagree about, but that doesn't mean there isn't truth.
That's exactly correct. And by the way, if the absence of agreement means nobody is right, the relativist is mistaken because non-relativists disagree with the relativist.
Right,
so
sure.
Their whole case there is self-refuting.
Right, it's a law of non-contradiction. Seems. Yep. Now, we're recording this in May of 2024, and there's a presidential election happening, and a couple of months ago, Donald Trump came out in favor of IVF. How do you help us? Can you help us think about IVF? I'm not speaking very clearly here today, Scott. As we're working through this and as we're thinking about the presidential election, this is going to come to the fore.
Yeah, here's the problem with IVF. IVF, in vitro fertilization, involves putting sperm and egg together in a test tube rather than the woman's body, which is what naturally happens in the fallopian tube. The problem with it, in my mind, is not that the process itself is intrinsically evil. What's problematic is how we treat the resulting embryos. Often what happens is these embryos are screened for defect before they're implanted. And if they hint at any defect, they're discarded and destroyed or used for medical research. Or we end up saying that, hey, we don't want all these embryos we created, so we're going to selectively reduce them, meaning kill off the ones we don't want. So the problem with IVF largely involves treating children who are image bearers as mere commodities for parental fulfillment. And there's a real mindset there that is deeply troubling to me. So when Donald Trump or anybody else gives a blanket endorsement of IVF as being a moral good, anybody with a pro-life worldview is going to recognize, wait a minute, you got to hedge that. That's not a good thing to say. And you can't claim pro-life credentials and urge that we rush full steam ahead on IVF, regardless of how we treat the embryos. That just doesn't jive with a pro-life worldview. Now, that does raise the question, what should pro-lifers do when you have an imperfect candidate running.
Right.
And here's the election in front of us right now. You have two very flawed men. Both
Yes.
of them are morally flawed. Joe Biden is a known plagiarist. He's a known liar. He's a known moral failure in his marriage. There's a lot of things that we could point to. Donald Trump is a lot of those things too.
Yes.
But we have two candidates, both with flawed character, but one has really flawed policies that impact millions. And so, what should a Christian do when given that choice? Well, I suppose one could say, I'm just going to sit the election out. I'm not going to be involved at all. And that might be defensible. But I think what Christians have a duty to do is vote to limit evil and promote the good insofar as possible, given the hand you've been dealt in a particular election cycle. Look, politics is always going to involve flawed candidates with flawed character and sometimes flawed policies. But some policies are worse than others. And I think we have a moral obligation to apply our biblical worldview in a way that limits evil and promotes the good insofar as possible. I'm not here trying to endorse a candidate. I'm just saying what the principles are that should guide us. I'm not interested in sectarian politics that says I'm always going to vote Republican no matter
Right.
what.
Right.
Look, if the Republican Party ditches the principles I care about, I'm going to ditch them. My support for the Republican Party is contingent, not absolute.
Amen.
If the
Yeah.
Democrat Party were to suddenly wake up tomorrow morning and miracle of miracles start advocating for what lines up with a biblical worldview, I would switch party affiliation. So it's not a blind adherence to a particular party. I'm just asking the question, which one in the real world lines up best with what I think is our duty to limit evil and promote good?
Yes, I remember when Donald Trump spoke out about this. He made his case was, well, there's these beautiful, beautiful babies that have come around, and like not contesting the fact that that process has led to there being beautiful babies, but it did kill innocent human life. So like
Yes.
this is what happens. I remember when I think it was 2000 when Bush and Gore were running, and I at the college I went to, Christian college I went to, there's a kind of party hosted by the college Democrats and college Republicans for the debate. And I remember listening to that debate, being around a bunch of other students. And the question came to George W. Bush about his pro-life status and pro-life opinions. And he said really clearly, and it was the first time I had heard it like this. He's like, my job is to defend the life, think about the life of all Americans. And he just brought it back to this basic idea of perpetuating and making life good for all people, either those inside or outside the womb. And I remember just being really convinced in that moment. And some people would accuse me and have accused me of being a one-issue voter. How is it that we can look at abortion and the pro-life cause and see this as something that's worthy of pointing our direction? I heard one person say at one point they would vote for a pro-life communist dog catcher if there was somebody who was pro-choice. So I'm curious, like how do we think about that, and how could you help us think about the issue of being a one-issue voter?
There are always other issues. Look, of course, abortion isn't the only issue, any more than rescuing Jews was the only issue in 1940, or freeing the slaves was the only issue in 1860s. But some issues are dominant, and it's wise for Christians to pay particular attention to those dominant moral issues. And what I would like to point out is that some candidates disqualify themselves based on the positions they hold, even if there are other things they do that are good. For example, imagine a head of state that had a wonderful education plan, would do wonderful at educating students, also had a great healthcare plan that would cause people to live longer, but he believed it should be legal for you to beat your wife and would work to keep that practice legalized. Wouldn't that disqualify him even though he had other good traits? In other words, his good deeds would not overwhelm his bad ones.
Right.
We would disqualify him based on that. Or imagine a culture that said to blacks, we will protect you as long as it meets with popular approval in a pluralistic society. And although we want to reduce racial genocide, we're not going to make it illegal. Well, someone who held that position, in my view, would be disqualified from holding public office because they were fundamentally denying the natural rights of a particular class of human beings. And therefore, on that basis alone, they would be disqualified. Now, that doesn't mean the other party and the other candidate are 100% correct on everything, but it does mean that particular candidate of the party that supports legalized wife beating or legalized racial genocide is disqualified in virtue of the principles they adhere to.
Yeah, interesting. Scott, would you tell us a little bit about your new book, or the updated version of your book, and what you've done in that, and why people might want to get it, particularly if they have the first edition?
Well, pardon me, I'm going to show you a graphic here.
Okay, great. Looking forward to it. And while he's getting that, folks, I just want to encourage you to look up Scott's ministry, and this will be something that will be incredibly helpful for you. Look, and go to YouTube and find the debates that he's done. I found it to be very helpful. One time I was brought into a situation here, since I've been at Wesley Biblical Seminary, where there's reporters who knew of our activity, particularly at the Dobbs case at Jackson's Women's Health happened right here. And so because WBS is so connected to that, they came and interviewed me. And what I did, Scott, is I went back and found as many interviews like this that you have done, and I just got that locked into my mind so that I was ready to deal with that camera crew when they came in.
Yep. Here's the visual. Bottom
is
the first edition. Top is the second.
Okay.
It always bugs me when authors do a revision or they do a second edition and all you get is some fancy new artwork on the cover. And you drop a truckload of money and you didn't really get anything more. I promise you, the second edition of this book has 8 new chapters and 10 rewritten ones.
Wow.
It is a total update and rewrite. And there is a lot of new content there. For example, there's a whole section in there on what it means to argue well, like what we started with on the program here. What's a good argument? What's the correct way to answer for an argument? We lay a lot of groundwork before we even get into arguing for the pro-life views so that we argue correctly. Then there's a whole new section on what are the underlying worldviews that make abortion plausible. For example, there's a whole chapter on the woke worldview. How is the woke worldview, the critical theory worldview, driving the abortion debate? That's in there. There's a whole section on how postmodernism impacts the abortion debate. How does philosophical naturalism impact the abortion debate? These are important things to look at. I'll tell you why, Andy. We're talking to people who do not come to the abortion debate completely free of presuppositions. They're bringing their worldview to the table. If you don't understand that underlying worldview that they're coming from, you're going to talk right past them. Then later in the book, there's a whole section on who are the major thinkers, who are the people in academia driving this debate. So there I engage people like Peter Singer, Michael Tooley, David Boonin, Kate Greasley, who's a newcomer to this debate, but very persuasive, very winsome, and her arguments need to be engaged. So I give the readers an overview of what she argues and then spend some time in interacting with her arguments. Then there's a whole section on what does a pro-life church look like? People love to tell pastors, you got to be pro-life. Okay, what does that mean practically? It's not enough to just shout a conclusion to a pastor. Here's what a pro-life church does. And I give 4 things that a pro-life church needs to do. Then there's a whole section that is going to make some people uncomfortable, where I make the case that it's not enough for you to just read the book and become philosophically pro-life. You need to get about working in your community to reach 500 students on the pro-life issue, and I give you a game plan for doing this. How do you start? By reaching out to local homeschool networks, and then jump from there to reaching church youth groups and local Catholic and Protestant high schools. It really doesn't take much to reach 500 high school students in your community. You'd be surprised. And then I give you a blueprint for what your presentation might look like. So this book is a mix of both the academic and the doing part. Here's what it means to live this out. And it's what I've learned. over the years of 34 years of doing this. I've joked with my wife. It's a good thing I'm not a word of faith guy, but I've joked with my wife. I said, if my plane went down in a blaze of glory, everything that's been in my head for 34 years is now on paper. It's here.
Okay.
So, it would not represent the end of me if that happened. I pray it does not. I want to be here for a lot of time, but at least it's out of my head and onto paper.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad that you've done that. I'm tempted to ask you, okay, what are those 4 points for a church? But here's what I want to tell people to do. Get the book. Get the book. This is an important thing to be able to pick up on. And I could look back at my own work as a local church pastor before I came to serve in the seminary. And I think this is an area where I was weak. I think you would have heard several times a year me make an argument in a sermon, but maybe in light of the work that I was doing Scott, I was with the Salvation Army for 15 years, and we had our own kind of programs that were heavy on our shoulders. But sadly, even though the Salvation Army has a pro-life statement, doesn't stand up for these matters, and because it's maybe makes it a little bit more too controversial, and we don't want to get out of be less popular with certain donors, and that's too bad, because the theology is there, and I just look at what I had done, and I didn't do well enough in
well, in your case, though, it sounds to me it was more a matter of not principle being misguided. You just didn't know what a pro-life pastor looked like. What should I be doing? The more problematic stance is the one you just described. The church leader who says, listen, my job is to respect a consensus in my church. No, your job as a pastor is to forge a biblical consensus. Right. Your job is to help people arrive at a biblical position, not respect whatever unbiblical worldviews they hold.
Wow. Yeah. Contend for the faith once for all delivered to the saints. Yeah. I like that. I like that language. That's really helpful. Scott, is there anything coming up soon that you're excited about? Anything that you're going to be doing?
I'm just concluding a season of doing a lot of fundraising banquets for pregnancy centers that help women with unplanned pregnancies. And even there, we teach apologetics. We give people the case for life. In fact, they all leave that banquet knowing how to defend their pro-life view in a minute or less. They all leave knowing how to do that. I lock the doors until they demonstrate they can do it. No, I don't go that far, but they know how to do it. And then this summer coming up, which I'm really excited about, this is the time when I reach the most students at Christian Worldview conferences and forums. I'm involved as a faculty member at Summit Ministries out in Colorado that equips pro-life and church-going kids how to defend their Christian worldview before they go off to college so they don't lose their faith. They actually thrive conveying their faith. And I teach there and looking forward to doing that. That kicks up in about 2 weeks here. So that's what's on my plate moving forward. And I'm excited about that.
I love it. I remember hearing, I can't remember where it was. It might've been on a famous podcast, like maybe Joe Rogan or something like that, or somewhere else, but somebody took your argument and it got to be kind of national news. Somebody had heard it. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like there was somebody
who might have been Seth Dillon, the head of the Babylon Bee.
Yes.
Yeah. Seth is a good friend of mine.
And
he's read The Case for Life. He's a good friend, and he's fully capable of defending what he believes. So it's not like I was the guy that made him who he was. He's on his own, plenty capable.
Yeah, I loved it when I heard that. I'm like, wait, I know where that comes from. Well, Scott, my last question is this. The name of my podcast is More to the Story. I always ask people, I like to think of that in a theological way, that there's more than just getting our sins forgiven. There's sanctification, that we have the privilege of God intersecting in our lives in such a way that we can become more like Christ and we can be holy. But I'm also interested in knowing, is there more to the story of Scott Klusendorf? You're on all kinds of podcasts, debates, conversations. There's maybe not, you said all of your thoughts around that book. But is there something else about you that might be fun for my listeners to hear? Something maybe you do, maybe a hobby or something like that?
Well, I do dabble in theology. I'm not going to claim the credentials you do. But I love reading Pauline literature. I love reading the biblical concept of justification, how we get right with God, and how that relates to sanctification, of how we become more Christ-like. But a hobby of mine, I'm a bit of a car guy. I have a 66 Ford Mustang, beautiful vintage car.
What color is yours?
Vintage burgundy.
Vintage Burgundy. Wow. Okay.
Yep. So I love it. It's a beautiful car. It's fun. It's a way to decompress. My wife has a Corvette, so we're a house divided.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, her father, who's 90, still buys Corvettes, and
Okay.
he gave her one for a song, and we now have one. It's not like I have all this money to go buy these things, but we've been blessed with them, and they're kind of fun. So that's a way I kind of decompress. I'm also a huge Anglophile. I go to the UK as often as I can. It's my happy place, and once a year I go over, take a solo trip for 10 days and just relax outside Oxford and think about life. Where do I want to go next in terms of what I'm working on? And those are kind of my hobbies.
Yeah, I love that. I'll be going to England. My area of research is 19th century Methodist movements like the Salvation Army. And so
Yeah,
that means I spend a lot of time at the Lambeth Palace Library, the John
sure.
Rylands Library at Manchester, and those have then the Salvation Army's own archives are there. So I'll be there in June as well for 20 days. I know what you mean. There's something about going
It's
back.
enchanting.
Yes.
England is enchanting. By the way, I love it in June in the sense that the days are long. You walk outside at 11 p.m., you can still see sunlight, and the sun comes up at 3:45 in the morning. It's incredible. Of course, the tubes are packed out, and the airfares and hotels are ridiculously priced, but it is a cool time to be there.
Yeah. Well, and tell your father-in-law if he keeps buying Corvettes and if he needs to give one to somebody, there's a school in Mississippi where there's the
I
academic
know
dean.
a Methodist guy who wants one.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yep.
It's great. Well, Scott, thank you so much for your work. It's been so formational for me and my own arguments and challenging too, even today, of like things that I need to do and how I can be stronger. Appreciate the way you responded to God's call so clearly when you're an associate pastor and you walk through that, and your faithfulness, I think, is something that God is rewarding. And even if it doesn't lead to rewards for you, there are probably thousands and thousands of people who are alive today because you've helped them make strong arguments. So thank you so much for your ministry, Scott.
Well, I am thankful the Lord uses flawed people who are still working on their sanctification and have a long way to go for his kingdom purposes. So, to that end, I'm grateful to be part of his plan.
Amen.